Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Guantanamo, Cuba. Prison cells for terrorists? No. Temporary camps for Cuban refugees in the 1990s who desperately want to flee the communist regime and live in the United States. In 1994, President Clinton decides that all of them will be held here, getting life skills and training before they're allowed in. 13 camps, and they are run by a career American Marine, Major General Michael Lehnert. When the United States is attacked on September 11, 2001, and responds with military action in Afghanistan, the country needs a place for its prisoners of war. After considerable debate, the Bush administration finds such a place in Guantanamo, and they have the man to run it.
The theory, I think, in Washington was, well, if he knows how to do migrants, he probably knows how to do enemy combatants or detainees. In point of fact, there's a vast difference.
Lehnert charges ahead, and in just days oversees the construction of a center for holding what at the time was believed to be terrorist suspects. But since then, his creation has become an international eyesore, not just for critics abroad, but for General Lehnert himself. He built it, and now he says it's time for it to close. Retired Major General Michael Lehnert, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you, it's my pleasure.
Usually prisoners of war are kept at the rear of the battlefield.
Yes.
They're not transported 6, 7, 10,000 kilometers to a different location to be looked after and interrogated and otherwise dealt with people who aren't in the active campaign. Did that strike you as unusual or an abrogation of duties, particularly by General Franks?
No, it didn't, and I'll explain why. Those that are familiar with Afghanistan understand that the infrastructure over there is really limited. You'll recall that the combat operations began actually at the beginning of winter, and by the time that the decision was made to begin moving detainees, we were into January. It's tough conditions over there. The medical facilities are limited. We had some that had been picked up on the field of battle already that were wounded. Some had frostbite. And the belief was that they had to be moved someplace out of Afghanistan somewhere else to be able to properly treat them because, and while I can't speak for the administration, I think they were concerned about an actual humanitarian issue over there if they were seen to be holding these detainees in really some very bad facilities and bad infrastructure. Additionally, and this is the part that I was not responsible for, I was not responsible for interrogation, but there was a belief on the part of many people in the administration that these folks were a gold mine of information. So there was a desire to take them somewhere where they could be interrogated.
Now, for people who have seen the video or who have visited Camp X-Ray, what you have is essentially what looks like an oversized dog kennel. Cyclone fencing, separate pads on concrete. You're in the hot Cuban sun. Was it, in your estimation, the best possible housing situation given the humanitarian concerns that you believe that were at hand at the end of 2001?
Rosalind, it was the only place that we could build given the time frame that we were afforded. We got the deployment order on the 4th of January. I was told, I received it while I was at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and we were told to have the first 100 cells deploy, form the Joint Task Force, deploy to Cuba, and have the first 100 cells built within 96 hours. Well, if you're going to get that, if you want it bad, you're going to get it bad. So X-Ray, of course, existed before. X-Ray was the place where we put those Cubans and Haitians that had been found to be not cleared for return to the United States. And they were held there generally in a very temporary fashion before being, in the case of the Cubans, moved through the Northeast Gate or flown out back to Cuba because they had a criminal record. So it was the only location that we could get up and running in 96 hours. But we were very aware that the atmospherics, so to speak, were very bad. And while we knew we could give them a first-class Navy medical treatment, the actual facilities are exactly as you described. They were 8x8 chain link fence buildings with external chain perimeter around a chain link fence around it. And so we knew immediately, once we got there, as soon as we had the first 300 cells constructed, that we were going to have to build something more permanent. And that more permanent solution was actually 40-foot containers that were prefabbed elsewhere and shipped in on barges and then linked together so that they could be air conditioned, you could have plumbing, you could have all of those things. And those began to show up at about day 65 or 70. But we knew that X-ray could not be a long-term solution.
What did you try to do to mitigate the rough living conditions, and did you have the blessing of those at the Pentagon? Because it's my understanding that there was a lot of confusion about what you were supposed to be doing, what you weren't supposed to be doing, and then there were the legal questions about what you could or should not be doing.
Sure. Well, first off, you know, if you're going to do interrogation, and even though my command was not responsible for it, you know, that's not something that's allowed in the Geneva Conventions. My guidance in terms of the Geneva Conventions was to be guided by, but not have to follow them, and at least to the letter of the law.
Did that strike you as odd?
It did. And so what I did was, the first thing is I had all of my senior staff read the Geneva Conventions. The second thing I said is that only I could make a decision to depart from the Geneva Conventions, that there could be no other person that would be responsible. And if some of the things to your direct response to your questions as to what we did is we requested to get the International Committee of the Red Cross in, ICRC. We'd worked with them before. Marines and soldiers work with them on exercises, know what their capabilities are. You know, we always used to say that if other than a Marine, if you're taken prisoner, other than a Marine battalion to come and rescue you, you want to see the ICRC there because they're looking out for the interests of the detainees. What I told the administration is we can say all day that we're treating them in a humane fashion until we have a third party, an objective third party there. The rest of the world won't believe us.
How much resistance did you get when you told them that?
Initially, we were told no. And then the second time, we got them in, basically working through the Southern Command, and we had a couple of good lawyers there that went really out on a limb and said to bring them in.
So you felt it was important enough
Absolutely.
to actually push back against direction from the White House on this?
From the Secretary
of Defense.
I don't. Yeah. And by the way, after he came down and met with them, I think he was of the conclusion it was the right thing to do.
Was it frustrating to get something that you had understood to be standard operating procedure, bring in the International Red Cross, adhere by Geneva Conventions, all the things that you had been trained, and by this point, you're now a general, to have these fundamental principles upon which you had based your military career questioned or dismissed for expediency?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if expediency is, well, maybe expediency is the right word. The argument that was being made in Washington was that since these were enemy combatants, but not necessarily a representative of any sovereign nation, that they didn't fall under the strict definition of a prisoner of war. And that because we were in Cuba, in an extra legal area, that the rules, the international agreements, and the Constitution did not necessarily apply. I didn't share that view.
And why?
Well, because every military officer takes an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. It's the oath that we take. It's not an oath to support the president or the chain of command, even though we're required to do that. But our first allegiance is to the Constitution of the United States. And it was my belief that the Constitution does not stop at the water's edge, at least in terms of our responsibility as commissioned officers to follow the U.S. Constitution.
You were in Guantanamo for 2 to 3 months.
Yes, 3 months.
How much freedom do you believe you had to treat the first men brought in from Afghanistan the way that you believed and the way that your subordinates believed that they needed to be treated, given that at this point the U.S. is now 4 to 6 months past September 11th?
Yeah. I had some freedom. I was beginning to get more and more direction, particularly to cooperate with Joint Task Force 170, which had the interrogation responsibilities. The whole concept of interrogation made me uncomfortable, not just because it's not provided for in the Geneva Conventions, but probably more importantly because, and this is based upon a personal belief, and that is that information received from prisoners as a consequence of interrogation, particularly enhanced interrogation techniques, is unlikely to be very useful. And it demeans us as a people.
Were you ever asked by those involved in Joint Task Force 170 to take part in interrogations? And if so, what did you tell them?
Well, we did, in a sense, take part in interrogations, and I'll tell you, explain how that worked. I would never release a detainee to a separate Joint Task Force without having the guards there. And the guards that worked for me would accompany that detainee to the interrogation facility, and their instructions were that if they saw things that were inappropriate, that they must report them back through our chain of command. Now, you know, there's an inherent tension then, because you've got one organization that's responsible for safety and security and care and feeding, and the other that's responsible for getting information. And in all fairness to 170, they were getting a lot of push to get information. You know, there was a belief that somebody in that crew knew where Osama bin Laden was. I sort of doubt that, but that they knew where they were. But the point is that they were getting a lot of pressure. So there was that inherent tension. Now, ultimately, after about a year, those two organizations were combined under one, and that became known as Joint Task Force Guantanamo. And that was about 9 months after I left. Because of that, that tension increased when the new folks came in.
How much unease did you have about Guantanamo as a place for holding people who were captured in Afghanistan or Pakistan or in other countries?
I had a fair amount of concern for two reasons. First, it was beginning to become apparent after about the second month that the sorting process in Afghanistan was not particularly good. And we'll just use some numbers here. There's been 779 individuals brought to Guantanamo. There are 155 remaining, which means that the rest of them have been sent back normally to their country of origin, often without any action whatsoever, although they've been incarcerated for long periods of time. So my first and most significant unease is that we had, many of the individuals we had in there were the wrong people. And then I think the other concern that I had, and this one's been borne out, is that, and it was based upon my experience before in Cuba. When we had those 18,000 Cuban migrants, we had a handful of people from third countries. They were in Cuba, they had a boyfriend or a girlfriend, they got into the boat to be with them, and suddenly we had people from European countries that were in these camps. And getting them back, even though they had never committed any breach of the law, was extraordinarily difficult. So knowing that, I knew that getting these individuals back to where they came from, and keep in mind that while I was commanding the camps, we had 33 different nationalities represented in those camps. Of the 300 that I ultimately had, there were 33 countries. And this was one of the reasons that caused alarm bells to go off for the administration, because they're wondering, why are all these nationalities showing up in Afghanistan? And in some cases, they were low-level fighters that just went off to fight. Some of them were there and were saying that they were in madrasas and studying, and were telling the truth. Others were actually terrorists who said that they were in madrasas studying for that year. So
you didn't really know whom you had?
No, not at that point. And additionally, because in Afghanistan we were paying $3,000 to $25,000 for each person turned over to U.S. forces, and we lacked the cultural understanding. You know, Afghanistan is a country that has had tribal warfare for thousands of years. There's long-standing feuds, animosities. So when a foreign country comes in and says, we'll pay $3,000 to $25,000, well, one of the things that you're going to see is one tribal chieftain is going to sell out his worst enemy, collect the money, so his problem is gone, and he's made more money than he's probably made in 10 years. So we were seeing people show up accused of being terrorists or working with Al-Qaeda, and in many cases the story just didn't hold up. And that caused me a great deal of unease. So now we're 12 years into this, and I knew that it was going to take a long time to close Guantanamo. And that's the reason why, at this point, I felt that with the opportunity to see the end of combat operations in Afghanistan, there's a natural inflection point right now where we ought to be putting all of our efforts into closing Guantanamo.
Now let's go back to 2002,
Sure.
2003. You're now given a new assignment. You're being sent into Iraq. But you just said you had some concerns that people who had nothing to do with what had happened on September 11th were being brought in, essentially because there was money to be had. Was it your place to say something to Defense Secretary Rumsfeld or to your commanding officer or to anyone in the U.S. government, maybe we need to slow down here and take a closer look at how we're trying to deal with what we know is a threat to U.S. security?
I mentioned my concerns to the chain of command before I left. I was in a completely different chain of command, and those concerns at that time would have been considered to be irrelevant because you focus on the mission in front of you. But I did mention those concerns before. And
what was the reaction you got?
The reaction was, I think there was a growing recognition that the wrong people were in there. But you know, I used to say it takes a Marine or Army captain to make the decision to put somebody on the plane for Guantanamo. It takes the President of the United States to make the decision to send them back. And we had created this situation, this legal situation, that once they were there, it was extraordinarily difficult. And I'll use for the administration to get them back. And I'll use as an example. One of the individuals we picked up early in the conflict was an Afghan. We called him Wild Bill. Won't use his real name, but he had been determined by competent medical authority on 2 different occasions in Afghanistan to be psychotic. Well, the question I had for the administration is first off, if this person really is a terrorist, how can we ever try him if he's psychotic? And if we're bringing him over here to get information, how can we trust it? Because the man has no grasp on reality. I believe it took nearly a year to get him back, with everybody agreeing that he shouldn't have been there.
Why, in your view, does Guantanamo need to be closed when there are still many Americans who believe that Guantanamo serves a useful purpose?
Yeah. Well, I think it needs to be closed because, first off, there's bad people in Guantanamo right now. Let me be very clear. There are people in there that need to be locked up for a long time because we did get better at sorting along the way. But they should not be locked up in Guantanamo. Guantanamo has become a poster child and a recruiting poster for the Al-Qaeda it's become an example, a bad example, to the rest of the world, saying that America does not support and follow the rule of law. So I'm not necessarily saying that all of these that are detained there at this time should be immediately set free. There are 77 of them, though, down there, of the 155, who have been declared by competent authority that they should be returned to their country of origin. And in some cases put under some type of surveillance or, but they don't need to be in Guantanamo any longer.
There are some, though, who will argue, well, we can't afford to take that risk.
Yeah.
Some people who were at Guantanamo went back to the battlefield, and they've been found to have been involved in incidents in Syria, incidents in Afghanistan, incidents in Iraq. We can't trust them if we parole them tomorrow. What's your response?
My response is this. First off, there is no doubt that some of those that were released returned to the fight. So if we released everyone today, some of them would return to the fight. We feel, though, that that risk can be managed. The U.S. military is the finest military in the world. We've got the biometrics on them. If somebody wants to go out back and do bad things, we're going to find them. I think that the more important question, though, is do you balance the risk or our respect for the rule of law? And I don't think that we can ever promise American citizens zero risk in anything. I took a certain risk, and you did as well, when we drove to this location to do this shoot, you know. And that risk wasn't from terrorists. That risk was from a traffic accident or something else. So I'm not diminishing it and saying that there is not a risk, but it's a manageable risk. And the real question is does our respect for the rule of law and the Constitution trump that risk? And I believe that it does.
Have Americans let the fear that everyone felt after September 11th cloud their judgment? Is that what you're saying?
I believe so. What is the purpose of a terrorist? It's to change us, change the way we act, and to make us live in fear. Well, I'd argue then that if we continue to keep Guantanamo open, then the terrorists have succeeded. They've forced us to move away from the rule of law, and they're causing us to live in fear. I don't want to live that way.
I'm sure you have seen over the years many people suggesting that the U.S. should apologize for Guantanamo. Is that necessary?
I think that's a decision that the administration would have to make, whether this administration or future administrations, as to whether an apology is necessary. I think probably more importantly than the apology is that as we look at this in the rearview mirror of history, is to make a solemn promise to ourselves that we won't repeat this and that we won't do it again. You know, we've done some things in the past. You know, for example, detaining the Nisai during World War II, and these things tend to happen during the after we've been attacked. Our elected leaders, of course, get a great deal of pressure. And I'm not trying to get them off the hook, but they do get a great deal of pressure from the individuals that elected them to do something. My view is, though, that this something was not what should have happened. We should have just said, okay, the Geneva Conventions apply, brought them to the U.S. immediately, and not used Guantanamo and not allowed it to become this symbol to our enemies. And there are many enemies out there. There are people out there who would willingly hijack another plane and fly it into the Pentagon or whatever replaces the World Trade Center. They'd do that again. So I'm not a Pollyanna. I realize that we have enemies out there. But as I used to tell my soldiers and Marines, when they would ask me, they'd say, General Lehnert, how come we're treating these people so well? You know that they would not treat us this well. And I thought it was always a gutsy thing for a young 20-year-old soldier to ask a general. But you knew it was on their mind. And I'd always respond honestly. I say, your question is absolutely correct, but it's irrelevant. Because if we treat them as they would treat us, we become them. and I don't want to see us become them.
Retired Major General Michael Lehnert, thank you so much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.